One. Welcome, everybody. My name is Gregory Mitchem. I'm with the House of Light. We're very happy to have today Paul Wallis. Paul Wallis is a researcher, a speaker, author of the international bestseller Escaping from Eden, also The Scars of Eden. He researches the world's ancestral narratives and how they speak to the origins as a species and as a potential today as human beings. His documentaries are also on the Fifth Kind TV and the Paul Wallis channel. Paul is watched by millions of people worldwide, and we're very happy to have him here. Paul, thank you for being here.
Good day, Gregory. Thanks for having me on.
All right, Paul, I have been following you for some time. I have all your books. I'm very, very excited to see, as somebody who is a Christian coming into Hebrew roots, when I was told that the Father, as we understand the Father in the Old Testament, wasn't really that Father, that was a big shock. You explain it so well. Can you just kind of go over a little bit about what people might not understand about the Elohim, as you would say in your talk?
For sure. Well, I think a lot of believers are aware that there is a problem in harmonizing the teachings of Jesus regarding God and the character of God as God appears in the Hebrew scriptures, in the Old Testament. We connect with Jesus, we listen to his revelation of a God of wisdom and love. We have the Apostle Paul's descriptions of the qualities of love. We have 2 Peter outlining all the divine attributes. And so we build up this picture of who and what God is, the God that Jesus addresses as Father. Then we go to the Old Testament and we start reading accounts of God, the character, doing very odd, punitive, unforgiving, brutal, genociding things. And we have to excuse that behavior somehow if we want to harmonize it with what Jesus has said God is like. Now, children pick this up straight away. A child will ask, you get to Genesis 3 and a child will say, couldn't God see what was going to happen? And why is it the death penalty for eating a piece of fruit? And hasn't he set Adam and Eve up to fail? If they don't have knowledge of good and evil, and then they make a mistake, how can they be culpable? Really, a young child in their own language will ask those questions. Get to Genesis 6, the child will say, why is a God of love genociding the whole of humanity? That's the worst crime against humanity, genocide, isn't it? How come it's all right for God to do? But these are very obvious questions. And then for an older reader, getting further into the Hebrew scriptures, you'll get to Yahweh's treatment of Saul, and it's a more ingenious preacher than I who can turn that into the story of a loving God, because the behavior of the God character is indefensible. It is so brutal and unpredictable, nasty, and vicious. But we're not allowed to say those things if we really think it's a God story we're reading. So what do we do with those texts? Do we say, well, the writers had an imperfect understanding of God at that time and were interpreting events according to a more primitive theology? Well, the early church fathers didn't go there. The early church fathers went to the more obvious explanation that these are not really God's stories at all, and that some of the stories that we've translated as God's stories are actually stories of other kinds of entity intersecting with human history in the deep past. And the way I unravel this mystery in the Eden series, Escaping from Eden, The Scars of Eden, and Echoes of Eden, is to go to the texts. And this is what I think, this is the gold of the Reformed tradition within Christianity, the impulse always to return to the texts and ask the question, have we read that right? And so that's what I did when I was given the opportunity of time to drill down into some of these questions. And I tackled it as translation issues. What are the translation keys to getting to the real meaning, what's happening in these texts? And Gregory, as you rightly say, there are keywords associated with Elohim that need a review. So Elohim is a keyword that is translated as God in a lot of the texts, but the root meaning of it is the powerful ones. Another word that we think we're reading a God story when we see it is Elyon, El Elyon, but it actually means the most powerful one. Elohim means the powerful ones. You get to El Shaddai and we think, oh, there's God again, except El Shaddai is the powerful one of the mountains, or the powerful one, the destroyer. You get to the holy name Yahweh and you think, oh, now I know where I'm at. That is the holy name for God, except that even a fairly casual reader can see that that name has been imported into earlier texts that previously were Elohim texts. The name Yahweh wasn't revealed until the time of Moses. So when you see it in stories that are sort of 1,000 years before Moses, that tells you straight away someone after the time of Moses is retelling an older story, and they're using the name they know, Yahweh, to tell this older story. And so my books peel all that back, and they say, instead of assuming all these words mean God, let's either leave them untranslated or use the root meanings of the words. And when you use the root meanings, a totally different story emerges. And it's not a random story. It's a story that runs in parallel with the source texts of the Mesopotamian cultures. Now, these are the cuneiform texts from out of ancient Sumeria, Babylonia, Arcadia, and Assyria. And when we found the translation key to those in the 1800s and began translating them, it threw up a very obvious question. Are these the sources of the biblical texts? Because scholars started recognizing various motifs in the stories. You have a Cain and Abel story. You've got a Genesis 3 story of an upgrade to human intelligence. You've got a flood narrative. You've got a Tower of Babel story. You've got the wars among the powerful ones as they conflict over Project Earth. And so from the 1800s on, serious Bible scholars were saying, are these the sources? Because it certainly looks like they are. It certainly looks like the stories of beginnings in Genesis are a summary form of these. Well, once you do the translation work I argue for, it becomes very clear that the stories that Abraham and Sarah brought with them from Ur of the Chaldees and sewed into the roots of what we call the Bible, they were the stories they had grown up with in their Sumerian-based culture. So read them in parallel and it throws a whole new light on these texts, and it answers these questions, these obvious questions that a child can identify as you read through the book of Genesis and further on into the Bible.
I always tell people when I do my lectures that sometimes we're not going to have the answer, but I believe we can learn the answer by deduction. And I think a lot of this is where we're seeing these parallels, for example, like in the Popol Vuh, where we see very similar accounts. I was telling my wife, this sounds just like it was in Genesis. It's the same story, right? Is that?
Yes, that's right. And that really grabbed my attention. I mean, the first sort of white rabbit that led me into the territory of paleocontact, which is what I now write about, was the parallels between the biblical accounts and the Mesopotamian accounts. But the parallels, the stories that repeat, as you rightly say, repeat in cultures all around the world. So you go to the Popol Vuh, which is the Mayan account of origins, and you read that and you think, hang on, this is a repeat. You go to Nigeria, sit down with the elders of the Efik people, ask them about the origins of humanity, and you think, hold on, this is a repeat. You sit down with the Zulu people and ask them to tell you about Unkulunkulu, the origins of humanity, or Mbabwana Warisa and the upgrade to human intelligence, the invention of agriculture, and you think, hold on, I know this story. Go to the Babylonian story, and it's Oannes and the Apkallu. There's Hunhunapu in the South American tradition. And it's not just that they are speaking of the same events in a way that could be a story has gone around the world in Chinese whispers, the correlations are a little bit more interesting than that. And it's quite clear as you look at the parallel stories, say between Sumeria, the Philippines, and the Bible, that what you have is a visual memory where each culture has found different metaphor and different language to report what the ancestors saw. So just taking those three cultures as an example, in Genesis, the story begins on a planet that's flooded, devastated, shrouded in darkness, and then something arrives, a ruach, which hovers over the waters. And the word for hovers is merahefet, and it means hovers like a hawk. And at that point, we're not really told what the thing is, other than that it's a ruach, which means something that creates a wind, something that creates a blast of wind, and it's hovering like a hawk. That's what the ancestors remembered. So, by the way, isn't it interesting? We think we're in a creation story, and yet we've got an eyewitness account. And it's the first clue that it's really a story of recovery that we're being told when the Ruach arrives. Now we go to the Filipino story, and there's an ancient ancestral narrative of a hawk hovering over the waters and clearing the land using vortices of wind from its wings.
Okay.
So hovers like a hawk in the Philippines. Hovers like a hawk in the Bible. It is a hawk in the Philippines. And in the Sumerian, it's just that little degree Vega where it talks about the four winds arriving to begin the terraforming. So that's just an example that clues you that we're being told a story using different metaphor, different language, but it's the same visual memory. Our ancestors are telling us what they saw. And as soon as you see that, you realize these stories are not inventions, they're not fables, they're not moral stories, they are stories that carry memory. And so you go back to Genesis 1 with a new question, asking, what memory does this story carry? And different answers emerge. And it is to do with the arrival of powerful ones, the Elohim, to help rehabilitate a devastated planet. Tohu wa bohu is the Hebrew, that means it has been devastated and laid waste. And then they start doing work using vortices of wind to terraform the land and begin re-nurturing life on planet Earth, and then sentient life, and then civilization. And that's the story that repeats all around the world.
That's excellent. If we look at Bereshit, Genesis chapter 3:21, I know that you'll understand where I'm talking about, where Elohim or Yahweh, if it would be the case, gives Adam and Eve skins. And I know in that particular passage, we just get, even I believe in the King James, it just says skins, but we've been led through theological programming to believe that they were animal skins. What's your thought on that? Are these animal skins, or are these human? Are we really talking about human skins? I guess what I'm trying to figure out is the how is the order? Are we bred as primordial light beings, and then we're somehow GMO'd by these Elohim, or how is that?
Yes, that's a great question, Gregory, because once you read Genesis 3 alongside the source stories out of ancient Mesopotamia, you realize that the conflict between the Yahweh character and the serpent character is a replay of the conflict between Enlil and Enki, two of the powerful ones in the Sumerian story. Now, in the Sumerian story, they don't call them powerful ones, they call them sky people, which makes all the clearer that we're talking about people who've come from the sky and are now interfering in the development of Homo sapiens. So Enlil, the senior, who's the commander of this region of space, does not want an intelligent Homo sapiens on planet Earth that's going to evolve into a civilization. He just wants a workforce. And Enki, who is the chief genetic engineer, or is in charge of the genetic engineering on planet Earth to create the workforce, actually wants humanity to be cleverer, more conscious, and happier, because he's worked out that a society of all male clones, which is how the story starts in the Sumerian, and we realize it's echoed there in the Bible as well. Adam's on his own, and then he's not happy, so will a pet make him happier? And a whole load of animals are wheeled past him, and that's not going to make him happier. He needs to be fertile. He needs to be male and female like the other creatures. Then he can be happy. So they have an argument over whether this should happen. And the upgrade makes the human male and female, fertile, intelligent, conscious. They've had this argument saying we don't want them too much like us.
Right.
Otherwise, we can't manage them. And that conversation repeats in cultural tellings all around the world. It's there in the Nigerian telling. It's there in the Mesoamerican telling. But Enki, aka the serpent, breaks ranks and does the upgrade anyway. So this now comes to your question. Prior to the upgrade, Enlil / the Yahweh character wants to keep the humans so unintelligent they don't even know they're naked. But what is the upgrade at that point? What were we before the upgrade? Were we like a furry ape? And then in the final upgrade, which accounts all around the world say was a fusion of elements of our visitor's DNA with ours, produced a hairless ape, to use that expression. Is that the nakedness that all of a sudden we've got these skins? To go back to your question about what does it mean to be given skins? All of a sudden, we're not covered in hair. We are smooth-skinned. We're naked. You could read it that way, and that could be exactly what happened, because that is the difference between us and the other primates.
Yep.
On this planet. We are the naked ones. At the same time, though, there's been an upgrade in our consciousness. We're self-aware, and we're self-aware seemingly in a way that other animals are not. So is it that we get the upgrade to our intelligence and consciousness, and having been spliced with these other entities who may themselves be smooth-skinned, we now look and feel very different, and we have an awareness. We have an awareness of nakedness that we're very uncomfortable with and that needs addressing. And any reader identifies with that. So when we read of Adam and Eve hiding in the garden because Yahweh's walking in the garden, we say, well, yes, I think if I was naked in a public park, I'd probably hide behind a bush as well. But I think all that is going on. We become the hairless primate, and we become self-conscious about being naked, and the story rolls on from there. But what is obvious and yet taboo in the current translations of Genesis 3 is that Christianity tells Genesis 3 as the story of a fall from a higher state to a lower state, fall from innocence to total depravity, fall from original goodness to original sin. But when you read the Genesis text, those doctrines are not in the story at all. Those are the church's reflections on the story. So any young Bible student will go to Genesis 3 and say, whoa, I'm just not finding the teachings in here. I'm not finding the doctrines in here. Read it closely enough and you'll realize there's no fall. It's an upgrade. The humans are more intelligent, more conscious, and fertile, and are now in a position when the story of human civilization can begin. And how we can read a story of an upgrade and get it twisted around so that it's a story of the fall is really a story of misinterpretation, mistranslation, and misreading the text. It's something a lot of Bible readers pick up on, but when they take their questions to their Bible study group or their pastor or their theological tutor in systematic theology, they will simply have the official doctrine read to them and said, that's what you need to believe. Don't get confused.
Excellent.
And when that happens, I would just encourage any theological student or reader to say, no, don't get confused. Stick with the text, stick with your questions, and let your questions lead you in your journey.
So you talked about Enlil and we talked about Enki, and I know there are some people out there, and I'm not quite sure if you do, because I want to understand it, but with the three, the Enki, the Enlil, and the Anu, should we be considering Anu as the father of lights, as James talks about in the New Testament? Is that a likened parallel? And even do you consider Enki as what we would know as Jesus or Yeshua?
Okay, one of the really intriguing things about the Sumerian stories, especially once you understand them as being the basis of the biblical stories, is that the Sumerian stories are not stories about God. Right at the beginning of the story, you have Anu used as language for a God concept, the originator of everything. But that name and that being is not a player in the Sumerian stories. The players are the sky people. The players are Enlil and Enki. Enlil and Enki are brothers. They are not humans. They are advanced beings. They come from somewhere else. That's why we call them sky people or Anunnaki. And they are the ones who are leading Project Humanity and Project Earth. So this is why if I go to friends who are in the ministry who are just teaching mainstream Orthodox Christianity, and if I take my questions to them and say, are you aware that our biblical stories are very probably based on the Mesopotamian stories? And they'll say, oh, yes, I think I remember that from theological college. And then if I say, well, do you remember that the stories from Sumeria, Babylonia, Arcadia, and Assyria are not stories about God, they're stories about sky people? Well, yes, I suppose you could put it that way. Well, what are the implications of our God stories being based on stories that are not about God? Oh, I hadn't really thought about that. What are the implications of our God stories being based on stories of beings we would call extraterrestrials? Oh, I really haven't put any thought to that. And they haven't put any thought to it because they've been busy, busy with ministry. And like most people, we are kept too busy to really have the luxury of following our curiosity. Now, this is a great shame if you're supposed to be teaching from ancient texts and you don't have the time to really probe them, because that is the white elephant that tells you there's something else going on here. So God doesn't really figure as a player in the Sumerian stories. They are stories of paleo contact, the intersection of human history with visits from sky people, Anunnaki. And those are the stories that parallel and repeat in our Bible. So it throws up the question, well, where does God show up in the Bible? Our idea of God that we get from Jesus, does that idea happen in the Hebrew scriptures? And if so, where? And if Yahweh isn't God in the beginning, is that name used to describe God later on in the Hebrew scriptures? And we have to go back and reread from the beginning to reframe the stories, re-understand them, and begin to notice where God is absent and where he's present. And I would suggest that all through the Hebrew scriptures, whenever you're looking at, say, Yahweh as an active player, you are looking at the story of an entity, a non-human entity. When you get into some of the language of the minor prophets in particular, and the texts of worship, you will find there that people are using the Yahweh word, and even some of the other words I mentioned as well, as language for God, the source of the cosmos, God, the creator, God the divine in which we all live and move and have our being. And that's what makes it confusing, that you've got words that can mean God here, but they're used here to translate texts about extraterrestrials. And that's the puzzle I sort of unpick in my Eden books.
Do you think possibly Paul knew something about this, as we hear to rightly divide the word? Now, at that time, there was only the Torah, so he would have to be dividing something of that nature. Do you think that there's a parallel there?
Well, this is the $64,000 question. If what I'm saying is right, that the Elohim stories were about other entities and these other names refer to other entities, did Jesus know that? Did the Apostle Paul know that? And again, I think there are many reasons why a careful reader of the Gospels and New Testament would have a question over what Jesus thought about those old stories, because he does not reaffirm them in the way we would expect him to. And almost every time that Jesus and those who wrote for him go to the Hebrew scriptures, it's not for a plain meaning reading of texts. They go and they find esoteric readings, they find prophetic readings, they find metaphorical reasons. Interpretations. So, for instance, the Apostle Paul goes to a text that is about looking after cattle, and he says, well, that's really about paying ministers, isn't it? Oh, is it? Okay, I'll take your word for that, Paul. He goes to another text about the son that Abraham had with his concubine, Ishmael, and the son he had after a close encounter, Isaac. And the Apostle Paul says, of course, this is really about two covenants.
Yes.
And you think, is it? Is it really? Well, in the plain reading, it's not. In the plain reading, it's about two sons. And the early church fathers spotted this, that Jesus and those who wrote for him were going to the Hebrew scriptures and they were doing something other than reading them in a fundamentalist way. They were finding emblems, motifs, types and shadows, finding prophetic readings. So then, where does that leave Jesus's view of the Elohim stories and the Yahweh stories? Well, first off, Jesus puts some clear blue water between him and them.
Yeah.
He does it every time he says, Moses said this, but I say this. And every time you see that saying, you have to realize what a huge put down that is of the Hebrew canon and the Hebrew law. Moses says this. Well, wasn't it supposed to be divinely authored? You can't put it in a box like that. But I say this, as if you've got the same authority. So right away, we're being shown Jesus is giving us something new, and there's a discontinuity. Now, this was not crystal clear in the beginning, which is why through the New Testament, you can see that the early Christians are trying to work out if Jesus rejected the Old Covenant law or if he reaffirmed it. It wasn't totally clear to them, so much so they have to have a council in Jerusalem in Acts 15 to settle the matter. And there's a lot of push and pull, there's a lot of argument. Even within the Gospel of Mark, you can see it's a debate because the writer says, look, when he said this, Jesus declared all foods clean. He cancelled the Jewish laws at that point, didn't he? The writer has to say it because there's an argument about it. Or you go to Galatians, and Paul is outlining the debate between him and the 11 over this issue of the place of the Jewish law. They haven't got it down. They haven't worked out, did Jesus repudiate the law or reaffirm it? You get to Acts 15, they talk everything through and they realize, yes, Jesus did not reaffirm it. And faith in the Hebrew canon and obedience to it is not going to be the basis of Christianity moving forward. It's all gone. And that's the decision they come to in Acts 15. So from that point on, it becomes a little bit surprising that the early church decided to glue the Hebrew scriptures onto the apostolic writings to make a Bible after Jerusalem said it's not the basis. But that historically is what happened. So now after Acts 15, you go back and you start looking for the points where Jesus is putting this clear blue water between him and the Hebrew scriptures. So you go to a very ambiguous saying where he says, heaven and earth will pass away before, even a jot or a tittle of the law can be ignored. Your righteousness must exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees who obey the law. Well, what's he saying? This will all continue until everything is fulfilled, he says. You can read it two ways. Either the law is eternal, or fulfilled means it's coming to an end. Fulfilled, accomplished means there's an end date on it. Acts 15 tells you which way to read it. End date. So Jesus is not saying the law is forever. He's saying when everything is fulfilled, you can forget about that. It will be done, accomplished, done and dusted. Acts 15 tells you that's the right way to see it. So how does Jesus feel free to put away the Yahwistic laws? Were they divinely authored or not? Well, he doesn't directly address that. I think the clearest place where you can get an answer is a point that a lot of people miss. They think it's a story about prayer, and it's actually a story about the Yahweh narratives. And it's the point where Jesus is talking about fathers and hungry children. Jesus says, which of you fathers, if your children were hungry and thirsty, would give them a stone or would give them a snake? And you and I might read that and say, oh, what a perverse image. Of course, no father would do that. Why would a father do anything as vicious and horrible as that? But it's not a random scenario Jesus has painted there. He's referring to something that actually happened in the relationship between Yahweh and the people of Israel. The people of Israel, the children of Israel, were starving, hungry, thirsty, fed up of starving in the desert, fed up of these emergency rations of manna, which meant they didn't even know what it was they were eating. And when they complain, what does Yahweh send them? He sends them a stone. Get water from the stone, he says. He sends them snakes, which then bite them, and a number of them die as a punishment for them complaining that they can't feed their children and are starving to death. So Jesus has picked on that scenario and said, what kind of father does that? If you evil lot know how to give good things to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? 180-degree difference between your Father in heaven giving good gifts and Yahweh in the desert giving stones and snakes. Now, the local hearers, the first hearers, the Jewish hearers, would have been hit between the eyes by that story, because what's that saying about Yahweh? Well, it's saying what he said 2 chapters before in John 8, when he talks to the Jewish leaders and he says, your father was a murderer and a liar from the beginning. He's talking about the Yahwist tradition. And it's one of those examples so prolific in the Gospel of Mark where he says something really powerful, really far-reaching, but he says it in such a way that he has left and he's in another village before everyone is thinking, wait a minute, what did he just say? And we have the luxury of having it written down. We can read it, and when we go, what did he just say? We realize he has totally distanced himself from the Yahweh stories. Yahweh is not the Heavenly Father. Right. If we want to know what God is like, we look at Jesus and how he relates to the source of the cosmos and addresses that source as Father and has this intimate, intelligent, conscious relationship with his Father, the source. And he does that for us, as a model for us. Those who wrote for him show that relationship so that we can see what God is like and what a relationship with God is really like. Really adding flesh and bone to what Jesus said in that moment that puts all those old stories of Elohim and Yahweh away. And it is why so many of the early church fathers, really significant ones like Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, Origen, Clement of Alexandria told us not to look for an alloyed vision of God in the Hebrew scriptures, and argued those scriptures were about a different kind of entity altogether. They didn't have the language of ETs, but they went that far. And they then said that international thought is a very good preparation for understanding Jesus and who Jesus really is. And by that, they meant where international thought had reached. They meant Stoicism. They meant the teaching of Plato. And if you read Plato and then go to the Gospels, you'll see what they meant. That Plato really does open up where Jesus and those who wrote for him were starting from in their thinking. And it was a far more cosmic vision of God. And it is the vision of God that's enumerated in 1 Corinthians 13, the qualities of love, and 2 Peter 1, the divine attributes. That is a vision of God, and the Yahweh and Elohim stories are about something totally different.
Yep. Yep. We got about 25 more minutes. This is awesome. I really appreciate everybody watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe Paul's material, and share, please, because people need to know this. Paul, a couple quick questions before we taper off here. I had a lot of, after getting into Hebrew roots, I had a lot of study understanding a lot of Galatians. Paul's writings are very hard to understand. And I just wanted to add, if I could, that I think a lot of people tend to forget that there was also another law. There was the oral law of the rabbis. It was very traditional law. And I think from what I see, that even when you look at Matthew 5:17, where Jesus says, I did not come to destroy the law, I came to fulfill it. These two words are absolutely rabbinical in context, and it is my understanding that, and it doesn't change anything, but on the contrary, it puts it into more of an understanding that the pastors and the teachers in the churches don't understand because they're not rabbinical, you understand? So if you would say, I did not come to destroy, in other words, he did not come to add or take away. That would be the rabbinical understanding. And also fulfill could also mean that it was rightly interpreted in that way. So when I find this interesting with the parallel, because if you remember, Yeshua, he tells David, who's hungry, well, go walk right into and get some the showbread. He'll walk right in there. He couldn't do that in the Torah. He would be killed. But the Melchizedek order has a higher order than the Levitical order. And I think when we put all this together, it could be a missing part to the puzzle, rather than the church saying, well, the law is done away with. It's not really done away with, but it's more or less, it's enhanced. And like you said, he was not pointing at all to anything that Yahweh said. He was contrary. He was saying everything on the contrary. It's like, well, you've heard it said from the beginning, but I tell you this. It was a much deeper way to understand it. Would you, like the soul of the Torah, if you will?
Well, I think it's a little more complex than that. I think Acts 15 goes well beyond saying Jesus had a deeper understanding of the law. There is a root and branch change at that point. And once you get to Acts 15, you really don't have to bother about disentangling oral law from the Yahwistic laws, the written laws, because it's all gone. It's a new basis for Christianity moving forward. They say, yes, look, it's all gone. It's no longer relevant. It's no longer binding. We'll just tell Christians to abstain from food sacrificed to idols. So what's interesting about that is that the focus they're wanting to bring is on God alone. There is only one God. So this is why at that point they say, we don't want to be serving idols. We don't want to be serving anything that's not God, which is an interesting thing to say when you just debated whether they really are God's stories in the Hebrew scriptures. They're saying we don't want to be worshiping anything that's not God. And that really, to be fair, was the agenda of the redactors of the Hebrew scriptures, who produced the final edit of the Hebrew scriptures in the 6th century BCE. The reforms that we see from King Josiah in the 7th century BCE, where he's trying to clean up Jewish practice and get rid of idol worship and have Judaism really operating as a monotheistic religion with only one God. What he did in terms of liturgy, the redactors did in terms of the scriptures, and they rewrote the entire Hebrew canon to turn it into a single book and give the appearance that it's a single story from beginning to end, a story of God using their holy name, Yahweh. And even though it created a confusion because it equated Yahweh with God, and it equated El Shaddai with God, it equated El Elyon with God, it equated Elohim with God, which is not the original meaning of those stories and creates a lot of confusion for us. Their reason for doing it, you have to affirm, their reason was they wanted the message to be there is only one God. The source of the cosmos and everything in it, that in which we all live and move and have our being, to use the Apostle Paul's definition from out of Acts 17. So that's really where they're going. That's what they're wanting to say. And it's also what the apostles, Jesus' brother, the early church leaders are saying in Acts 15, when they say abstain from meat sacrificed to idols. They're saying we don't want to be worshiping anything that is other than God, and that needs to be the centerpiece of Christianity.
What would you tell somebody that what would we now that we have this extra knowledge, how does that affect the gospel? Is there such a, because here's my conundrum, I'll be honest with you, because I love your part 1 to 4. If anybody has not saw it, please watch Paul Wallis's channel. He has Jesus in India. It's amazing. It blew me away. I'm now reading Paramahasa Yogananda and the text, which is, if you look at the first 5, there's a book called The Holy Science by another Swami, I forget his name, but he's taking the first 5 sutras and they're all in the Bible. It's there. So you're going to have a really tough time to somebody who's a scholar, or even at their church or something, and say, we all believe that Christianity is the one way through Jesus. Does this change the message at all? Because what I'm trying to really balance here, I guess you could say, is I understand, and we've all been through what we've been through the church, but now, and I know we don't have time for this, hopefully we can meet again, we haven't talked about reincarnation, we haven't talked about the consciousness of the Christ, we haven't talked about any of this, but I believe this all, and now I'm trying to balance, well, if we're the consciousness and that we are that which he is, and that's what what Jesus was trying to explain, that he and the Father are one. And then we see this also as a capsule within many of the Eastern, schools, if you will, which to my studies, as I understood, these people, the Melchizedeks or the Ebionites, as they called them, they branched off. And one went to the west and one went to the east. And I'll be quite honest with you, Paul, I think you probably piggyback this. I honestly see the east being more representative to Yeshua, to Jesus.
Yes. Well, that is why you had people like Origen and Clement of Alexandria and Irenaeus saying that Plato is a really good preparation for understanding Jesus, because Plato had synthesized international thought, including thought from the East. And the understanding of what we are as conscious beings, the understanding of our journey, our soul journey, our pre-existence, our incarnation, our life afterwards. Plato has pulled all that together, and in him you will recognize, oh, I think he's been reading the sutras. I think he knows a lot more about Egyptian thought, and there's a connection between Egyptian and Indian thought as well. And when you read Plato and go to the Gospel of John, you think, oh my goodness, I think the writer of John knew all this stuff as well. And you suddenly realize that the writers who produced The Gospels and the New Testament were scholars. They understood international thought. They were thinkers. They were not in a tiny bubble who had only ever grown up in synagogue and were now writing out the story of Jesus. The way they tell the story, the language they use, some of the detail of name and number in the text as well clues you. Oh, I see they've been reading some stuff here, and same of Jesus himself. And so in my Jesus in India series, I just shine a light on that and suggest if Plato was that clever, if the Apostle Paul was that clever, if the other New Testament writers were that informed and well-schooled, is it possible that Jesus was cleverer than we gave him credit for, and he knew a lot of this stuff, and that this is where some of his thinking had come from and how he had synthesized what he brought to the world? We like to read Jesus in a bubble, as if there were no influences on him, as if he didn't belong in time and space, geography, history, but he did. And we only add to our appreciation of who he was and what he said when we set him back in that context. But our reading of Jesus has been squeezed, and it's been squeezed from two directions. From the direction of the Roman Empire, which morphed Christianity into the imperial department of religion, and we now read the Gospels in the light of all the doctrines that they concretized in the years following Jesus. But it's also squeezed by our reading of the Hebrew scriptures as well. So in that final edit of the Hebrew scriptures, if we read that as the prelude to Jesus, we end up in a place that is all about us and them, us the righteous, them the sinners. We who will be vindicated with everlasting reward, they who will be punished with everlasting condemnation. Right, wrong, obedience, disobedience, worship, idolatry, and then we bring that framework to the Gospels and we think Jesus is talking about all those things. With those two forces squeezing our reading of the Gospels, we think the Gospel is all about worship versus idolatry, obedience versus sin, heaven versus hell, Christian versus non-Christian, church versus non-church. And this is a total distortion. If you read the Gospels that way, it will distort what it's all about. And it's very difficult not to read them that way when we've had 2,000 years of religious entrainment showing us how to read the Gospels. But again, you go to the... Sorry.
I was just going to say, how would you explain in a very short way the gospel? If because you hear this, yeah. What age-old question? What's the gospel?
Here is a key to begin unlocking a different reading. First of all, if you want to read it differently, get hold of a number of translations so you begin to get a sense of what are the questions about the words. What do the words mean? If you can get hold of an interlinear Bible, so much better, where you've got the words in your English translation, the Greek underneath the original Greek texts, and then you can look the Greek words up to find out what's going on. Now, if you do that, a great place to start is the very first sermon that Jesus toured with, because here in Matthew's Gospel, we're going to hear what Jesus's message is all about, summarized as a sentence. And the way it's translated in conventional translations is Jesus toured Judea saying, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." And after 2,000 years of religious entrainment, we think that means clean your life up because God is about to show up and you wouldn't want to be on the wrong side of him. You're going to be in big trouble if you don't. Yeah. That's what we hear.
Right.
Repent means go beyond the mind. Kingdom, we hear that, we think, oh, that's a feudal order where you've got a king and everybody else just obeys the wishes of the king.
Right.
Except you can translate that equally as realm. And a realm is a place to be explored. A realm is to find out what happens here, what's possible here. Go beyond the mind, because the realm of heaven, sky, space, the cosmos is at hand, is available to you. Jesus is saying, go beyond the mind, think with more than this, go beyond what you currently think, break out of your worldview, because the powers and principles of the cosmic realm are available to you. And then Jesus goes around demonstrating what that looks like. when he heals people of diseases, when he effects entity removal and sets people free from oppression, when he lives fearless and shows what that looks like, when he has meetings with people who lived in other times, like Moses and Elijah. Suddenly he's showing what it might look like if you and I were to explore the realm, the cosmic realm, and know that the powers and principles of the cosmic realm are available to us. Now, that language is very unfamiliar to most Christians, but it becomes clear straight away this is an invitation to explore. So that when we get further into the gospel and Jesus says, everything you've seen me doing, these and even greater things shall you do, we realize there couldn't be a greater invitation to explore what's possible than that. And he's talking about what is possible for human beings. There's no Christian, non-Christian framework inserted into that saying. The cosmic realm is bigger than those kind of boundaries. So when you realize that's his announcement, you begin to read what he did totally differently. And you go to the root meanings of keywords like that. Another key word you want to unravel is Gehenna, because it doesn't mean hell.
Right.
And once you unravel the church's traditional teachings of hell, you then realize Jesus's life and his death and his life after death means something different than the classic redemption story that the church has told, where redemption becomes a commodity that you can obtain through the doctrines and dogmas of the church in obedience to it. Right. That's a total distortion of what Jesus is on about. Jesus is about empowering our human potential, showing us what a relationship with the source is really about. And he reframes that whole idea of serving God as we serve one another, reframes the idea of loving God as we love one another.
Yes.
And the Apostle Paul, to go back to your earlier question, does exactly the same.
Yeah. And the kingdom is within you. I mean, it's not there. It's not there. It's within you. And I think that's where a lot of the Eastern meditation and it all, they get it all right. I feel very sad for people who are in the church or who are overzealous and they want to get people under the blood of Jesus to get rid of all their sin, but they don't realize that they're pulling people away that already are probably even more, you know what I mean? I mean, they have.
I do. There's a lot of unraveling of church traditional teaching and dogma and oughtness and imperatives that we don't realize have come from the church. They haven't come from Jesus in the gospel. And it takes a while to begin to see the wood for the trees. But it's a really important process because the distortion of what Jesus is on about has not only damaged the sense of well-being of millions of human beings through the ages, but it has led to the justification of all kinds of abuses, enslavements of people, conquests of other people's countries, all the auto de fe and the torture of the Inquisition period. People justified all that kind of stuff because their theology was rooted in a violent God, in a God of heaven and hell, in a God of punishment, so on and so forth. It's very important that we disentangle that, because if you've got a distorted image of God, it can be like living in a home with a parent who has mental health issues or substance abuse issues, where everyone else in the household has to tiptoe around for fear of offending that parent. Everyone else's well-being goes to mush. And we've kind of done that to ourselves as a species by distorting our image of God and thinking that's the world that we live in.
Excellent. How have you, Paul, personally navigated against the backlash for your discoveries?
For me, Jesus remains a real anchor point for me, going back and understanding him as well and as clearly as I can. Because often if people want to contradict what I'm saying or attack what I'm saying, they'll be surprised if I do that. And it's also my own refuge as well. But I think once you've seen translation issues that we talked about earlier, it really is like taking the red pill in the Matrix. You can't go back and see it the other way, because the other way, you can now see that's nonsense, and you can now see the logic and the corroboration of cultures all around the world sharing the same memory of our deep past. So it really does stack up in a way that yes, I might take abuse for it, but it's not that somebody says something and I'm really rattled by it, because I've actually been through that reframing. I've actually spent these years of study and understanding, so that I know, well, look, let me tell you, the reason I say this is this, and I go to something really solid. The reason I say this is this, and I go to something really solid. I can be agnostic about plenty of things, but there'll be a few pillars where I'll say, well, look, read the Mesopotamian texts, then read the Bible, and then tell me I'm wrong.
Yeah, and that's the whole key, is people don't want to put the effort in, and it's usually the people that I find that come against me or you or other people that are bringing the same message, is that they're not putting the study in, so they're speaking on blindly, really. I have
to be fair though, what's a shame is that if you talk to people at an academic level, or people who have the luxury of a lot of time to do Bible study, they will know a lot of what we're talking about, but it never filters through to the pew sitters in churches. So their pastor might be aware of a lot of what we're talking about, know there's credibility to it, but the poor person who's teaching Sunday school or leading a Bible study group or just attending that church will have no idea, because it's taboo and it's not discussed and it's not preached about. We discovered in the 1800s that the Genesis stories were based on the Sumerian ones, and yet all this time later, 150 years later, most Christians sitting in churches haven't been told about that discovery.
I think the most powerful thing would be if you could get a church and be in like a neighborhood and teach everything. I mean, that would be amazing, because you know, there's no Christian doctrine here. You know, we're going to introduce you some texts of the Bhagavad Gita or the Vedas, or we're going to see the parallels. And I think, to me, that's very interesting. I have one last question. I don't know if you're going to be able to comment on it, but as I got into Hebrew roots, I kind of got sucked in a little bit to the Kabbalah. And I saw some very, very interesting esoterical things that Jesus actually even said. And as you know, you might know, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Kabbalah, they talk about the Tikkun Olam, about repairing with the light, and the darkness must flee from the light. The scattering of the tablet, the tablets of the 10 utterances, bringing them back together so that humanity will perceive with the light, and the darkness must flee. The problem is everything is based on the Sephirah with the tree of life, and the tree of life is based on the Yud Vave. My question is, do we have to throw Kabbalah out completely for any other point of text because it's based on the Yod He Vave, or does that not have anything to do with it?
No, we don't have to throw out the Kabbalah at all. People often think I must be saying that because I talk about the evolution of the Bible and how it's been altered and how it evolved, and then this final redaction that deliberately confused the stories to make them look like a seamless story of one God. And they think, well, if you're saying that, then that blows Kabbalah out of the water, but it doesn't, because the most recent redactors were not just scissors and paste editors doing a bad job of harmonizing a story. They did far more than that. First of all, as I say, they had this profound teaching: there is only one God, the source of the cosmos and everything in it. That was the message. And they did plenty of other things in the way they knit that story together, in the language they used, in the way they formed the text. That means there is other information in the top layer, the most recent redaction, that again is not preached on, except from time to time someone will pick up an aspect of it, and you'll get a book like the Bible Code come out and say, I've just spotted some patterns in the text here. The top layer, the most recent redaction, is full of information, plain reading and esoteric reading. And I don't rubbish that at all. they, again, just like the gospel writers, were theologians and philosophers who wrote that. So it's not to rubbish what we have in its current form in the Hebrew at all. It's just that my work doesn't go there. My work says, yes, but I want to know what the stories were in the beginning, because there's information at that layer that has been taboo for a very long time. And it's the information about paleo contact.
Excellent. And for those of you, as we wrap this up, Paul's got a couple excellent videos that I know people were talking about. Why are we here? If you're on YouTube, you could go see this. Also, the scary truth behind original Bible stories. We really love that one. Again, his books, Echoes of Eden, right? We have that one. We have, it's a trifold series. Buy them all, right? Yeah, there you go. This one and this one.
Escaping from Eden. And the Scars of Eden.
The Scars of Eden. Excellent. Just and you know, me and my wife, we're sitting here, Paul, reading, and you know, I'm just, you know, I got it all, you know. You know,
oh, wonderful. All
yeah,
marked up.
That's all what I do. I have a whole, you know, and the funny thing about it is I haven't read a lot of books, but now I have more books than I've ever read, because now it's just, it's invigorating. It's unbelievable.
It is. It is. I have such an appetite on me as well. And I'm really thrilled. People contacted me every week, and most weeks it's every day. And I hear people of every age demographic saying they have an appetite on them to learn and to find out what's really going on and to drill down into their beliefs. An appetite like they haven't had in years. And I find that very, very exciting.
Do you think that has something to do with an ascension process that's actually happening right now?
A short answer, yes, I do. We're in a different space than we've been before. I think it could be all kinds of reasons for it. The ancients talked about thin places. And I just wonder if our whole planet might be in a thin place right now, where people are having more experiences, more awakening experiences, and rapid unlearning and relearning than I've ever seen in my lifetime before.
Amazing. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Wallis, thank you for being here. And Paul is, he's got all of these thoughts, and I don't like to boast on anybody too much, but it's very similar to my thoughts and my thinking, because I love the near-death experiences. I love the unseen. I love to pick puzzles apart and put them together. And I think you're kind of the same way. So hopefully we'll be able to get a chance to talk about reincarnation, because that is an amazing piece that's been pulled out of the Bible, peppered through the Bible still, that we still see it.
Yes, it is.
But people don't see it. And I think, and if I just want to say one last thing, I think the majority of the people that do see it, that have big congregations, are afraid to let people know, even if they know it's truth. Because why? Because we all have been told that the greater is the more. Sometimes the less is the greater, because now we have truth. If we have a bunch of people and we're not carrying truth, what I'm saying is people will lose your whole congregation if you come and talk like we are.
Yes, that's right. And to be fair, you have to feel for people who know that if they go there, they are risking their entire livelihood. And not only that, but they could split their churches as well. I was very fortunate that I was between congregations when I wrote these books, because it gave me the freedom just to follow the data and then to share that journey.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you, Paul, for being here. And thank you all for
Pleasure.
watching. All right. Thank you, Paul. Take care. Okay. That is a wrap.
Great. Thanks, Gregory. That was really good.
That was awesome. We love it. And hopefully, you know, maybe a couple, 3-4 months down the road, if we can maybe talk about the esoterical more. I'm really into that. We never touched on that today, but as far as like the reincarnation, I did a 7-lecture series on it, and it's just amazing. And I had more people watching videos about reincarnation than even, you know, getting into the basic Bible.
It's fascinating. And I think, you know, what's frustrating about the thing we were just talking about of pastors not being able to break this taboo is that I think in a lot of churches, if you started sharing this kind of information, probably about half the people in the congregation would say, I knew it.
That's true too.
You know? Either because they've seen it in the text, or because they have a memory of a past life, or whatever it is, but it's all been off syllabus, not been allowed to mention it. But as soon as they're given permission, yeah, I always thought that might be the case. is what you start hearing from people.
And these past lives and these deja vus with people that they're having, they're remembering things. And I think that even goes back to something that we weren't supposed to remember these things, right?
Oh, yeah, that is true. That's very, very interesting. Plato talks a bit about that we're not supposed to remember previous lives. We're not supposed to remember who we are. We're supposed to piece it together in this incarnation. And there are hints in indigenous narratives that memories of planetary resets, previous civilizations, are taboo in the sense of we are just not allowed to talk about that. Yeah. You know, we the elders know about this, but it is not something we talk about in the sense of protecting humanity from the trauma of what went before.
Do you think that
so
when I was going to say, do you think that when Yahweh says you are not to have any type of spiritualist, you know, we know that these are spiritualist things, you know, do you think maybe he didn't want people to know about, kind of like in the garden, he didn't want people to know what was going on?
To be honest, I think that was really no different to well, I mean, I could to give a controversial parallel, it was like in Australia during the pandemic, we were told very clearly, don't believe anything you're told other than by the government appointed medical officer.
There you go. Yeah, I get you.
So it's about controlling the narrative.
Yeah.
And I think some of those laws against mediums and spiritists are really about controlling the narrative. Yes. And you see it repeat in Christianity, because it's just so intriguing to me that in Hebrews, you've got an acknowledgement of ancestral spirits surrounding us. And then in 1 John 4, the writer of 1 John 4 expects Christians to be getting communication from spirits, and he never says what they are. Those are part of the primitive Christian experience, but it doesn't become core curriculum, because how do you manage that? And so by the time you get to the Montanists controversy, you've got a church that says Christians only have one source of information, and it's the clergy. And the clergy in this pyramid-shaped structure where you've got the, I mean, ultimately, where you've got the emperor and God at the top, the bishops and senators in the middle, and then the people at the bottom who believe what they're told and do as they're told. The idea of believers saying, well, yes, but my spirit just told me this, or my ancestor just told me this, so what you say isn't quite right. That's unmanageable. And you get to the Montanist controversy and you realize the church just wants to rule all that out. Couldn't care less whether it's real or true. That is now just a story of management.
It's 100% spot on. All right. Well, thank you so much.
It's the same pattern. Well, I look forward to our next conversation.
Absolutely.
And, hope your audience enjoys part 1 of our conversation.
I think they'll love it, Paul. And you're in Australia, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, you stay safe, and may the blessings of the Almighty be upon you.
And you too. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Paul.
Bye.
Much love. Bye.